Hello and welcome to lecture 2 of week 4 on organization design. We're going to be talking about the different elements of organizational design and structure. Two important things to keep in mind. Organizational structure is not static. Organizations are continually changing their design and adapting to their external environment. Another thing to keep in mind, the larger a firm gets, the more complex this process becomes. We'll be talking about organizational change in our next lecture. And there's no silver bullet for organizational design, as we will discover. Different situations require different designs. Um, uh, Internal environment and external environment can both dictate different optimal designs for an organization. The first model that we're going to look at is what's called the bureaucratic model. This was developed by Max Weber, the organizational theorist from the late 19th, early 20th century that we looked at in our first lecture. He advocated for the bureaucratic structure, funnily enough, not in our age when we use that term disparagingly, but Weber's ideal organization was characterized by a strong division of labor and specialization, very consistent task performance, standardized, a strong chain of command, impersonal managers, managing strictly facts as facts, you might say, and targets were met or not met, and employment and promotion were based on performance and technical expertise. The strengths of that were related to efficiency, and often that could be efficient. It would prevent, in theory, favoritism if promotion was based on the achievement of clear targets. And in theory, again, people should know what they're doing. If you're operating all according to a same book of procedures, then hopefully you're all on the same page, and that can lead to efficiency and greater clarity of job performance. Weaknesses include the fact that it can be fairly inflexible when dealing with change, for example. It can be difficult to make exceptions if you've ever been told that something is policy and that you can't be helped. You've encountered that negative side of bureaucracy. And it can also neglect the human side, both in terms of staff and customers. So there are some downsides to bureaucratic structure. On the other side, and partly as a reaction to the bureaucratic model, came the behavioral model and the behaviorist organizational theorists. And they much more stressed organizations as groups of people and the way that interpersonal processes were conducted. They identified 8 such processes that are listed here. I won't read them off one by one. And essentially, they said they compared the bureaucratic organization at one extreme, which they call the System 1 design, with a more democratic, decentralized structure at the other extreme, which they advocated, and they called the System 4 design. And between those 2 and 3, you had something leaning still towards bureaucratic, but less so, and then with your 3 leaning slightly more towards open and decentralized, but not quite all the way to a System 4. The strengths of the System 4 design that they advocated were that it does stress the human side, the human component. It maybe gives a bit more value and dignity to human interactions. But its flaw is that it still argues the same as the bureaucratic advocates, that there's one best way to organize. And as we argue in this course, from the contingency view, like many things to do with organizational management, it depends. It depends on the context that a manager is working in. And that's supported by the evidence. So here you have just a summary of the way that those 8 interpersonal processes are performed in a System 1 organization versus a System 4 organization. I won't go into all these in detail, but they're in the slides, which I will post for you to read. Next, we have the management theorists who believed that organization design was heavily influenced by these 4 factors: technology, environment, size, and life cycle. They didn't advocate, so they were a bit more subtle in their organizational recommendations and believed that the there were other factors. There was no one best fit, you might say, but other factors determined what organization style managers eventually opted for or were resulted from the interplay of these factors. The first one, technology. Here they were really talking about the complexity of that technology. The argument being that the smaller the output, the less complex the technology. So for unit or small batches, very customized outputs, you had a less complex technology. And then for very large output, think which they called continuous process, think oil refining, for example, or mining, you had very complex technologies. And then in between, you had what they called large batch or mass production. Here you'd have things like assembly lines, auto manufacture, that sort of technology, which they saw as complex, but sort of a middling level of complexity. They argued, interestingly, they found rather that in that middle group, the large batch, was the most standardized and the most like what the behaviorists would call a system one design, very centralized, very much rigidly following standard procedure, which makes sense if you're thinking of an assembly line in particular. There's going to be small variation and would much more suit a more authoritarian style of management that's based on efficiency. However, at either extreme, they found, interestingly, more System 4 type, decentralized, dispersed authority organizations. That's at a general level. Other situational view looks instead at the environment, and what they found is that in stable environments, you're more likely to find, again, a standardized System 1 routinized type model, a bureaucratic model, and in a unstable and predictable environment, you'd be more likely to find a decentralized System 4 style of organization, which makes sense if you think about it. The requirements to adapt in an unstable, unpredictable environment would require more decentralization and would make a rigid standardization of process and procedure less effective. It has more trouble adapting. There were also some findings related to size, but the link was somewhat small. Or rather, sorry, the relationship with technology they found held with smaller firms, but then that link broke down. When they looked at larger firms, that technological aspect wasn't determinative. So these were researchers at University of Austin that were testing the findings of Woodward, and they found that those findings did break down when they looked at larger firms. And in general, they simply found that larger firms were likely to have less centralization. The larger you got, the more you started to look like the System 4 decentralized design, which perhaps makes sense given it becomes simply a necessity the larger the firm grows. And then you had finally the organization life cycle studies that found that there is often different structures preferred based on which stage of the life cycle a firm is in. So perhaps a younger firm may choose one organizational form as it's just starting out in a new industry or a new business, and then as it grows towards maturity, it becomes more stable. Perhaps it adopts something more like a System 1 bureaucratic design, which perhaps it even then follows into its decline. So all different factors that can inform what sort of organizational design a firm opts for or moves towards, depending on whether you view it as a completely management-led process or more of an organic process that arises and sort of dictates structure rather than being necessarily 100% a managerial choice. The idea here, though, is that the structures would actually evolve. They weren't static. They found that there was no one structure, rather it changed based on the passage of time and the passage of the life cycle of that firm. So getting increasingly sophisticated in terms of viewing taking a contingency perspective, viewing that no one best way for all firms or even for the same firm across its whole life. Other considerations for corporate design or organization design rather include this, the strategy. What is the corporate level strategy? Are we doing a single product strategy, in which case a functional departmentalization that we looked at last lecture can work well, where it's just a unitary form. We're going to look at it in a moment here, but you just divide up. You have a marketing department, a finance department, an operational department, and you get economies of scale, which you can capitalize on because you are all working towards the same product rather than having to divide the attention of those different functions across multiple products within the same organization. If we do talk about related diversification, well, now we need to maybe consider other organizational design forms that we'll look at and that we've talked about, maybe that are more product related. Maybe now we departmentalize based on product rather than on function. And then when we get into unrelated diversification, we have yet again different considerations and different variables perhaps upon which we decide to departmentalize the structure of our firm. Within each of those business units, we will also want to consider the business level strategy. Are we pursuing a defender strategy? Perhaps that is more suited to a tall organization with very centralized authority. If we're prospecting, we're trying to be innovative, maybe we need a much more flat, decentralized structure so we can make quick decisions and quickly act on ideas that are working. And if we have an analyzer strategy, well, maybe we need some kind of hybrid between the two. Oops. So the U form is our functional departmentalization that we looked at last lecture. We have our CEO sitting over, say, marketing, finance, operations, HR, whatever. But it's divided based on the function. All your accountants are sitting over here in finance. All your engineers and manufacturing foremen are sitting over here in operations. All your HR people are sitting in the HR department, etc. That is the U form, which stands for unitary. And as we talked about, it's essentially the same idea that we talked about last lecture, this functional departmentalization. On the one hand, you get good economies of scale because you're applying the same function. You're not replicating work across product divisions. There's one marketing department that does all the marketing for everyone. There's one accounting department that does everyone's expenses, etc. But on the other hand, you can get siloization and maybe a failure to see the bigger picture, like we talked about last lecture. Here's a, I guess I didn't need to draw that diagram. There's a much nicer one here for you of a typical U form or functional departmentalized by function organization. Another style that you'll get is what's called a conglomerate or H form. This is kind of the other extreme in a sense. Here you have probably unrelated diversification. It stands for holding, like a holding company that just owns a lot of different unrelated companies. And essentially, each of those separate companies, whatever they're doing, is just operated in a sense like its own U form business. Essentially, it's like a bunch of U form businesses. But very little overall coordination at the top of the holding company. So in theory, each of these would just be a different company or a different industry even. With very little economies of scope or scale or shared resources between them. As you can see here, each one of them is a completely different silo. We finally then have the M form design, the multi-division design, that product and those product and customer based departmentalizations that we looked at last lecture would be M form divisional designs. And basically this is kind of a best of both worlds approach. Those activities that can be centralized and shared across divisions are. Oftentimes that might be something like procurement. If there's that, because you'll get economies of scale is one reason. If we can buy everything centrally, we can buy in a bigger bulk and A, have more control, and B, hopefully get better prices because we're buying at scale. But then where we need quick decision making and more of a team product focus, we can have those in their own divisions separately. So here's an example in this case of Hilton Hotels, where each of the brands is its own division. Now, what they don't show is that across here, you might have, say, one overall procurement department or one overall, I don't know, accounting department that offers staff services to all of the divisions. But in terms of operations, and more direct services, each of these would probably have, for example, their own HR partners or their own finance partners as well. There'd be some replication of function within each division. You'd have all of the functions in greater or lesser scale, as well as shared services across all of them. Something that's often talked about is something called the matrix design. This is an interesting one where you try to get the best of a U form and an M form design. You might call it the poor man's M form, where you're trying to get the benefits, but you don't have maybe the resources. You still are limited in size and can't commit functional staff to different divisions in a way that replicates those functions because you are simply too constrained in your ability to staff each division with all the relevant or required functions. I think we should be able to get a view of it here. Essentially, what you do then is you have a functional departmentalization, generally speaking, but then you have projects that run across those. So what you end up with is you have your actual line manager or you're the person you report into directly, but then you'll have a matrix manager that manages your project. It becomes complex. If it sounds complex, it's because it is. It can work well, I suppose, if you have highly motivated, capable staff and very skilled managers. But the problem you run into is for the same reason that you develop a matrix management structure, which is constrained resources, you end up stretching your people very thin. Advantages enhanced to flexibility. In theory, you might get more motivated team members because they're working on lots of, there's more variation in what they're doing, which means they learn new skills. If you can make it work, it's more efficient and allows for decentralization. The disadvantages are unclear reporting relationships. If I'm being matrix managed by 3 project managers, none of whom are my actual boss, that can get confusing and even frustrating. Um, um, that can also lead to problems with decision making when there's disagreement because the project manager isn't actually in charge of anyone, depending on how much authority they've been delegated. So it can lead to group dynamics that lead to either delayed decisions or poor decisions. So this is why it's called a matrix management system. Basically, you have your actual functional divisions and your chain of command here, right? But then you also have this dotted line matrix management where each project manager matrix manages a team for whatever project they're working on. And the fact of the matter is actually sometimes it'll look more like this, and people might be on multiple matrix managed projects, which, as I said, can lead to real conflicts and coordination issues where people get stretched too thin and reporting relationships aren't clear. As you might have guessed, I've been matrix managed and worked in a matrix managed organization and found it quite challenging. I would not say that it was successful in the organization I worked for. Uh, Hybrid designs, matrix management is really one of the hybrid designs, but thinking back to that earlier slide in our previous lecture where you had divisions based both on department and geography and um, and product and customer, that would be a hybrid design where sort of the right tool for the job. And this tends to happen in a very large company. Few organizations, as it says, just follow one purely. Maybe it turns out that a particular region requires more focused resources, and it makes sense to have a division based just for that region. But then in the rest of the regions are all clumped together and departmentalized by product. Who knows? The key takeaway here being choose the tool and the configuration that best suits the needs of your company. Finally, we have what you might call emerging issues in organization design or current hot topics. One of them is team organization. This is very common, I'd say, in tech firms, looking at innovation, where essentially it's just you're always working on a project. You don't have a permanent division or a permanent function. You are simply working in teams on the basis of projects. And when that project finishes, you're often redeployed to a different project in a completely new configuration. The virtual organization, this is an interesting one. If you think about, say, gig work or the gig economy, perhaps an entrepreneur who hires a virtual assistant, often uses subcontracted, temporary outsourced workers. Perhaps located no office even. I've worked with game developers, a game development company that operated in this way quite successfully with programmers based across the world in some cases. No central office, little minimal formal structure, different types of contracts. Yeah. That can work better or worse. It's kind of dependent on the nature of your product. If you need more permanence and more commitment from your staff, or if it's an industry that requires face time and the formation of stronger relationships, this is going to be less successful perhaps, or at least harder to manage, especially if you never actually get face time with your other team members or manager or subordinates. There's also this concept of the learning organization. This isn't really a structure. This is more of an approach to organizational culture, I'd say, organizations that have a strong focus on continuous improvement and personal development. I've also worked at organizations like this. It can be very rewarding if there's lots of opportunities. Maybe they pay for you to do an MBA at a place like Nichols Online, or perhaps they send you off to a training facility that is owned by the organization. I've had that experience as well, which may be mixed results. Sometimes workplace training isn't as enjoyable as it's hoped, but this is a cultural focus that some organizations have. Internationalization adds another complex dynamic to organization design. And as we talked about with hybrid design, sometimes international organizations will adopt hybrid designs based on the different regions. Perhaps there's an overall regional departmentalization, and then within regions, they adopt different approaches to organization design based on the culture, the context, the customers, etc. But as with anything, when you go international, you increase the complexity because now you're operating in multiple external environments. Here's some examples of those configurations. Different ways. Here, we're still operating with just a strictly, basically a functional design, but then we've got all our international stuff happening over here in one division or one department. Here we have, again, a very typical regional design. We've got North America, Europe, Asia. Here we've got one that's much more divided locally by locality. So it's basically the same as this, but on a even further subdivided by country. Again, more resources are required here, but perhaps the nature of the product or the size of the organization allows for country-based departmentalization. And then here's probably the most hybridized, where there's a division based on products, but then for one of the products, they also further departmentalized based on region. So all sorts of different options. These ones include that international aspect in different ways, 4 different ways to fit the international component of operations into your organizational design. And of course, the one that's not mentioned here is you might just operate a strictly functional design and kind of ignore, just treat your international customers as part of your unitary form organization. And it just, the international division just kind of is slotted into the day-to-day operations of the other functions. So good. Next stop, organizational change. When you're designing and changing organizational design, you're dealing with people. And so there are approaches and strategies for organizational change that we will examine in our next lecture.